tonight is a very different night. Tonight is the night that we learn our math, and it's not the simple math. I have. It would be much easier if you had a copy of my notes, although even that isn't the easiest thing to understand. But I want to share with you how I arrived at the information that you have, and among them are several books that I think might, well, I don't know if they'll interest you, but this is the first book here is called 913, the Secret Wisdom of Genesis. 913 is the value of one word in Hebrew, the very first word of the Bible, Bereshit. So Bereshit is also a number, and we're gonna be working with numbers tonight. This is a highly educated group, so I'm going to give you several things to think about. Another book that I use for this tonight is called 137, the riddle of creation. Again, this is by Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg. Both of these books, and the third book that I have. So they all deal with Genesis. They all deal with the first chapters of Genesis. This one happens to be called Wisdom Integrating Torah and Science. But all three of those books deal with the concept of the mathematics of Genesis, and especially Genesis 1 is this book, 913. Another book that I'm using, or that I used, because I needed to become familiar with the mathematics of the Bible. And so I have a book that's called 70 Faces. It's written by Rabbi Ginsburg's student, and it's written by Avraham Trugman. Avraham Trugman, basically the 70 faces are the 70 different secret ways that one can understand scriptures. Because you see, we have what we would look at as the very simplest way. What it says is what you get. But as you're going to find out tonight, and as you're going to find out over the next couple of weeks, because I'm not only going to talk tonight about pi mathematics, but I'm also going to talk to you in a few, well, maybe even next week, the idea of the other number system, phi. Phi is the idea of the use of God's use of the word of art in the creations of all things. So we're going to learn a lot of different kinds of things. And so as we go through this, please understand that it is not the easiest. And I thank you for being willing to even attempt it, because again, this is, as my wife would say, this is more high school, college math, because we're going to take words and we're going to articulate numbers, the values of the different words as opposed to the other. And so you're going to find this is quite different than what you would be normally thinking. In the beginning, I want to use the quote from Galileo, because Galileo, obviously, we think of him as an astronomer, but he's also a mathematician. And he said to us, mathematics is the language with which God has written the universe. Now, we think of God creating the universe, but in mathematics and in science, many of them understand that the universe has been written into place as much as it has been created and put into place. And so as we go through all of this, we begin to understand that there's far more to the story than we could ever understand. Now, I want to try to help spend a lot of time giving you some understanding of math and the story of creation. Now, besides various websites, which I just shared with you, I also went to several articles on Google. And so you can use lots of different sources. There's no one place that you're going to be able to go that you're going to get all the information. You're going to be searching, which is not a bad thing to do. I first want to convince you that the mathematicians don't invent math. When I was in school, math was not my favorite subject. In fact, Many of the subjects weren't my favorite because I didn't understand how I was ever going to use them or what I would ever find from them. But then I began to discover that there was something more to this whole process that I hadn't looked at before. And so as I go through this study, this understanding, mathematics is the key to the Bible. Now, we think the key is actually the writing, and that's partially true. But in Hebrew, unlike other languages, Hebrew is a language of numbers as well as letters. In fact, the letters are the numbers. And so we've got to understand that God, using this language, and he spent years, and according to the Midrash, he spent 1,000 years looking into Torah before he created the first thing. 1,000 years spent thinking about, dwelling on, understanding. Now, why would God, who is infinite, omniscient, why would he need to spend 1,000 years? It wasn't for him. It's for us. Clarity comes through understanding. Understanding is going to be hard to come by. Now, a friend of mine really asked me to teach this. And actually, it was Rod, who showed me an article, and he says, I wish somebody would teach this to people. And I just smiled. And I understood all that's going to happen and how hard it's going to be for everybody to understand. In fact, you may have to watch this video multiple times. I also have the notes that I'm going to be using tonight, and you're welcome to write me, and I would be glad to send you a copy of these notes in order to help facilitate what's going on. But let's first start about talking about the name of God. In the first chapter of Genesis, we are given the name of God as being Elohim. But Elohim is only a facet of God. It's the judgmental facet. God's real name, basically, if I were to use his real name, I would have to simply say Hashem, because it's a four-letter name that we really don't know how to pronounce and are not to use. Now, you can use the permutations of that name. So in other words, you can use those same four letters, change the order in which they are, and you can use that as the name of God. And one of the most common ways that that's used is in the name called Havayah. Havayah is made up of Hey, Vav, Yud, Hey, as opposed to Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. So that one is permissible. So as we look at it, God's name is composed of four letters. Two of them are the same, but there's basically four letters. Understand that most words, the root of that word is three letters. And now we have a conundrum. God used four. So which one is not part of his name? Which one is not the root? Well, they're all parts of the root, because he's also giving us an understanding that's far deeper than what we would normally think of. His name is composed of Yud, Hey, and Vav. Now it also ends in Hey. Now you may have heard that this four-letter name, and another way that it's pronounced is tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton is a Greek word that means four letters. So literally, it's a four-letter name. But again, these four letters are significant. Each letter of his name represents a world that God has created. Not a world necessarily that he lives in, because he lives everywhere. The first world goes along with the letter Yud. Yud talks about, in this particular case, a world called Atzilut. It's the world of emanations, the world that God first created. It's the Big Bang, if you will. The second world is called Hey. It's an expansion of that first world. In fact, that world is referred to as Beriah, or the world of creation. So in other words, In Atzilut, things were there, but they were not formed. Everything was, well, together, if nothing else. In the world of creation, everything began to separate and we began to get things. The third world, it was an extension of that, and that's the letter Vav, and that's the world of Yetzirah. Now things that were there are now beginning to form and create ideas or life or areas. And then finally, we come to the last hay, and that's the hay of expansion. That's when everything becomes a world that we live in. It's the world of action. Now, again, roots, 3-letter root versus a 4-letter root. There's something that is in the present tense is often left or often led by a prefix. So in other words, if I'm looking for a prefix for this, I actually have one. The letter is Yud. Yud is a prefix. Now, that would mean that I've already settled it. The other 3 letters happen to be the root. But there's more to it. You see, the last letter, hey, is a letter that's a suffix. It's an end of letter word. So now the 3-letter root is Yud, Hey, Vav. That sounds great, except for the fact that there's also another place that a letter can be inserted into the root, and that's the letter Vav. Vav is used as oftentimes as the word and. Now that's not all, because you see, Yud is also dealing with what we would call the future, or the, let's see, yeah, Yud is the future tense. And Vav deals with what we would call the past tense. Well, that leaves Hey. Guess what? Hey is present tense. But again, what does that tell us? Well, in his own scriptures, we need to understand that the letter Yud is masculine. Vav is also masculine. Hey is feminine. And the sages tell us that when we think about these 3 letters, we should think of he is, he was, he will be. He is his present, he was his past, he will be his future. God is eternal. And it all comes from the 4-letter name. So God has hidden into this 4-letter name great numbers of things. Now, the first thing that he created, by the way, wasn't a thing, but time. If you go to the first word of the scripture, it's the word is Bereshit, in the beginning. Well, beginning is time. Things started. That's the beginning of everything. So in the beginning, time started. Now, if you read the creation story with any kind of depth at all, you know that Havaya, God, does not even appear in that first chapter. Excuse me. But his title is alluded to in the structure of the chapter. And then again, this goes back to the books, back to the idea of 70 faces, and back to the idea of 913, the wisdom of Genesis, the wisdom of Bereshit. We must understand numerology. Now, up until now, most of us have thought of numerology as occultic, or, well, maybe we thought of it as being divine or having some sort of mystical relationship between the words and incidents. But for that reason, we've usually chosen to avoid numerology. But numerology was a study, and still is a study, of the sages, the great ones that are still alive today, as they begin to look at the mathematics of what's going on. You know, I had a chance when I lived in Indiana to go to the Museum of Natural History in Chicago. There I found an exhibit with my wife. The exhibit was called the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you've all seen the pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we talked about the Copper Scroll. Well, if you haven't, you can always go to YouTube, or you can actually Google it and you can find out about it. But there's one thing that I don't know if you ever noticed. that's the fact that when you look at the scroll, something is missing. There's letters there, but there's no vowels. I happen to be standing next to a little boy who asked his Jewish mother, Mommy, read it to me. What does it say? And his mom looked at him and she says, I can't read it. He says, well, how's come? It's what we read it at synagogue. He says, no, there's no vowels here. You see, vowels help to make a word understandable or clear. Because you see in Hebrew, there is no particular letter that would be a vowel. They're all 22 consonants, but some of them can become vowels. So it makes for a rather difficult time. Now, the Hebrew text of the Bible was originally written with only 22 letters. There were 4 letters that were also added later that were what we would call end letters, sophit. But all of them only represent consonant sounds. And at the time of the letters can be produced by a vowel, it's because of the way they read it, which again tells us that there's more than involved in reading Hebrew than just simply being able to look at the letters and it pops into your head. When I was in Israel, I went to a second grade class. It's all boys. And some of them were very interested and some of them were not so interested. But they were reading Genesis chapter 1, which I found fascinating when I got there. And it wasn't the fact that she called on Billy and Billy read verse 1 and Johnny read verse 2. No, they all read the verses together. And as they're reading these verses, the thing that struck me was the fact that she led the dictation of the words, and she was very precise in giving the words their understanding, their meaning. In other words, she had taken the vowels and the vowels now created the words that she read. Because you see, there are some words in Hebrew that have multiple meanings, and we're going to run into one of those tonight, and that word is devar. Now, normally we think of the word as devar as word, but we're going to find out that it means more than that. Now, a vowel or a vowel point is either a dash or dots or whatever. It's called a nikadot, a nikadot. The nikadotes were designed in the 10th century CE by a group of Jewish scribes that were known as Masoretes. They created these dots and dashes, which I called nikadot, in order to seal the language and make it so that people could read the language without having to have somebody, a cantor there to read it to them. These vowel points were meant to supply the vowel sounds to the text to codify the pronunciation. And on the outside of those texts, there would oftentimes be a commentary to help them again, which is what I did to my Bible, and many of you probably did to yours, is added those margin lines and information. Now, these vowel points may be frozen and actually have frozen the meaning of words. So some words are much easier to understand because that's all it can be. Torah numerology has been known from ancient times, but the Torah is more than simple letters and numbers. What we easily see is the plain and simple story because we read it in English. Now, the early sages mastered the mathematics of the Torah. And the reason they mastered the mathematics of the Torah is because the Torah itself lent itself to an understanding. Let me see if I can find my share button down here. And I want to share with you. Maybe I can't. Pause more. Oh, there it is over here. Share. I'm going to share with you. worlds. Okay. Now you can see my text, and I'm on the wrong page, so forgive me while I move myself up to the top. Now, I shared with you earlier the worlds of creation, and this is how the map would have looked as we were looking at that particular idea. But this is what I really want to look at now. This is Genesis chapter 1. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. That's the words. Now, to the right of that, I gave you the Hebrew writing. And I gave you the Hebrew writing, and prior to thinking about this, I gave you the first letter of each of the words, because that's going to become very, very important. Now, I've already told you that the word Bereshit has a value of 913. But the entire sentence also has a value. The value is 2,701. Well, that's something. And we'll come back to that later. But I want you to think of the text differently. First off, I want you to take a look at and see if you can count and use the right side. Count the Hebrew letters. How many letters can you count? How many letters does it take to make my sentence? And I will stop for a second. My wife has already figured it out. If you finish counting, I hope you came up with 28. Now I want you to tell me how many words I actually have there, and each red letter is the first letter of the word. So how many words do I actually have there? 7. 7 words, 28 letters. Now, that would be wonderful if that was the end of it. But you see, the rabbis didn't end there. They began to look through that whole sentence, and they said, is there any other place in the Bible where I can find a count of 28 letters, 7 words? Can I compare it to something else? Is there another hint that's found within it? Lo and behold, you find the word Exodus, chapter 20, verse 1. I don't know how many of you have ever gone to Exodus, remember what Exodus chapter 20 is about, but it's actually the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments. God spoke all these things, or all these things, saying, all these things saying. Now, the words in this particular case read from left to right. And what you find in the very first word is, and these things are, and Yevoda, Yidavar. Yidavar. Now, the word davar means say, to speak. But the word davar also means things. When God spoke things into being, he said them, and they were. Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? He said these things, and they were. So if we look at it, the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, God spoke 10 sentences, 10 utterances. In Exodus chapter 20, Moses related 10 commandments. So the commandments in Exodus 20 relate back to the Genesis chapter 1. In fact, there are books written on the comparison between those two. Shouldn't be a surprise. Early colonial history. University of Harvard was created. At that time, it was only a college, but it was a religious college. And so if you went to the library, you could find a book on the book of Genesis. In fact, they had 600 books on Genesis. 600. How many more do you think there are today? Imagine what's going on in the world. Now let's go a little bit further. Take a look at your Bible. You might want to open it up, and we're in chapter 1, so you don't have to go far. And I can tell you it's on page 1 or page 2, depending on whether you got an art scroll. But let's look at this for a second, because what it's going to tell us is the next thing we need to understand. We know the first sentence, in the beginning, God creating the heavens and the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the divine presence hovered above the face of the waters. Now, I want you to notice, first off, verse 1 and verse 2. Neither one end with a period. Neither one end with a period. In fact, we have to go all the way to the end of the third verse before we reach the real first sentence in the Bible. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So all of the stuff that's written in those first 3 sentences, that is the beginning. Now, as we look at it then, everything was astonishingly empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. The deepest to home, but we'll get to that later. Darkness was here. Well, why was darkness here if God is light? Because in order for 2 things to occupy the same space at the same time, one has to move out of the way. It's a scientific law. In order for God to create a place for us, he had to eliminate himself. And when he eliminated himself, he took with him the light. And when he took with himself the light, then what's left is the darkness, which is what we see when it talks about the astonishing emptiness and darkness. So God has eliminated himself. Now I've got a circle here with a diameter and a radius, which will come into play. But the circle is to show you, and I want you to understand, when God removed himself, it was a perfect circle. In other words, he emptied himself out. Now, all of a sudden in the verse, it begins by saying, and then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So what did he have to do? He inserted himself into the darkness, and there was light. He inserted himself. So if I were to simply take the line, let's use the line radius. Radius leads me to the center. From the outside to the middle, God inserted himself into this emptiness, and it became filled with light. Now, right now in my area, it's dark out. But darkness isn't what we were talking about in the first 2 verses of Genesis. My darkness, there's still some light in it. In fact, black is multicolors gray. But the interesting thing is, when we look at this, I want you to see the circle, the circumference of the area that God evacuated and reinserted himself into. The diameter of the circumference of the circle is pi. Whether you understand it or not, one of the first mathematical thoughts that went into our story is the fact that God used a mathematical formula for putting everything together. And the formula involves a endless number, 3.14159 goes on to infinity. There is no answer to the end. And that's going to be the fascinating thing, because it's going to give us hints about some things that we've not even thought about. And I'm sure you haven't thought about unless you've read the articles. So let's go back to our story then. Okay. So in this particular case, I showed you the can't find myself. Okay, here we go. Remind yourself of the worlds we create. As you're looking at this particular piece of object that you're looking at, I want you to, well, let me tell you. When we were earlier on, when we were looking at the worlds before this, here, Bereshit bara Elohim, the value of that sentence is 2701. When we look at the second one, now remember, both of them have the same number of letters and they have the same number of words, but the value of the letters is not the same because each letter has its own value. And so the value of the letters of the word for Exodus 20 is 1,322. 1,322. Now, as I'm going through this, several things popped into my head that I hadn't thought about before, but I found in the book called The Riddles of Creation. And that's a number. Mathematically, 2701 can be turned into a multiplication problem with a root of a prime number of 37. 37 times 73 equals 2701. That same prime number, 37, can also be found in 1332. 37 times 36 equals 1332. Continuing the math, 2701 minus 1332 gives me 1369 left, or 37 squared. Do you hear a number keep coming up over and over again, 37? Do I know what that means? No. Do the mathematicians know what that means? I don't think so, because it's one of those things that we're working on. So 2701 subtracted from 1332 gives you 1369. Now the value of 1369 is the value of the verse, not 2001, but the last verse of chapter 19. What a coincidence. But we're not done. 1369 is the value of the phrase in Genesis chapter 1, or verse 2. The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. God is using the same numbers over and over again. Why? Well, there's a hint there. Well, let me give you a couple more fun facts. The word for earth in Hebrew is haaretz, which is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Well, that word haaretz has a value of 296. If I take the number 37, my prime number, and divide it into 296, I'd find out it comes out 8 times. 8 times. Another word, God spoke. The word spoke is vidvar, has a value of 222. Again, prime number, 37. 37 divided into 222, 6. And obviously, if I took and added the two numbers, 296 and 222, I'm going to end up coming up with 518, which again is another multiple of 37. Letters are numbers and numbers are letters. Mathematics is part of what we're going to be working with. Now, when we were looking at the 10 Commandments and I gave you the first verse, well, the first verse really is an introduction to the 10 Commandments. It's not a part of them. It starts in the very next verse. That's when we begin to understand the 10 Commandments. And again, the first two commandments, God spoke and everybody got to hear them directly. And then after that, people said we couldn't take anymore. And so God told Moses, and Moses shared the rest with them. But let's go back to the commandments themselves. So in Exodus chapter 20, what we find is that the 10 Commandments consist of 620 characters. That's the value of the word keter, or crown. The crown of us is the keeping of the commandments. It's the prize that we work for. Because you see, our goal is to be one with God. God already has the crown. You and I work for the crown. And notice that Keter is, again, if you're looking at a Kabbalistic chart, you'll understand the fact that in the Kabbalistic chart, what we actually have are 10 spiritual attributes or areas that you and I attempt to get better at. Now, if we took a look at the same 10 commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 20 or chapter 9, they don't have 620 letters anymore. God added letters and words and meaning. In fact, he added 88 more letters. 88 creates a word called nahal. Nahal is the word for creek. Well, there is no creek mentioned in Exodus chapter 20, but there is one in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 21, where he describes water flowing from that mountain where he and Moses were meeting. There's a few more secrets that I want to talk to you about that we haven't really discussed yet. And I've already used up almost 45 minutes of what time I've allotted. So you're going to understand that I'm not going to finish tonight what we're talking about. So before computers, Jewish scholars would study the Babylonian Talmud. And today they still do it, only they call it daf yomi. Daf is the word for a record or a recording of something. Yomi is the word for day. So this is a recording or a page for the day. Excuse me, Jews each day will go over one page of the Talmud. Now the Talmud has 2,711 pages. And if they're only going to cover one page a day, it's going to take, well, actually about 7.5 years to go through the whole thing, which is rather interesting because when we first started, or when the Jewish people first started looking at the Talmud or at the Torah, it took them 3.5 years to go through the Torah. It wasn't divided into 52 sections. It was divided more into smaller bits and pieces because they saw it as being far more important for them to do such a thing. So one cycle of Daf Yomi, one cycle of that. Well, today is, if you were studying the Talmud today, you would be studying page number 13 in the book of Sanhedrin. That's what you'd be studying. And if you had a Talmud, you'd find that the Talmud has what they call an A and a B. in my Talmuds that I have, because they have it in English and they have it in Hebrew. And so A page is the front side, B page is the back side. And so the front and the back creates one page. That's what they would have studied today, is one page. And tomorrow they will be on the next page, and they will continue that for 7.5 years until they run through all 67 books. So we have, I don't know what we would call a large understanding, but I say this for this reason. How do I want to put it now? I want to tie it back together with the Talmud, try to make it make more sense, and why we have to understand pi. The number pi is the mathematical constant. It's the ratio of a circle's circumference and its diameter, which we've gone through. The number pi appears in so many formulas across mathematics and physics. We don't study math and physics anymore. Our jobs probably don't require it. I'm retired. My job doesn't require anything. But anyway, it's an irrational number, meaning that it cannot be expressed exactly as a ratio of two integers, but it deals in fractions, such as the fraction of 22 letters times 7 words, or divided into 7 words. Simply put, the number appears everywhere in math and physics, and it appears everywhere in the Torah, but you can't see it because it's hidden. Pi is at the core of the universe. Pi defines all the cycles that are spinning in space, all the orbiting atoms, all the orbiting planets, all the solar systems, the galaxies, all of them are defined by the value of pi. It's the central number of physics. Pi is also the fundamental constant of math, which means that you cannot change pi without changing everything that's in math. 1 plus 1 would not equal 2 if we change pi. The entire number system would need to be changed just because we changed pi. Now, at this point, I want to introduce you to two great sages. One's name was Isaac Luria. He was probably one of the most famous Kabbalistic sages there ever was. But the problem was that he was so brilliant, but he had no time to write down his ideas. So he left us nothing. Fortunately, he had a student, and his student's name was Chaim Vital. And Chaim recorded his studies or his teachings and created a book called Etz Chaim. Etz is the word for tree. Chaim is the word for life. So his writings were about the tree of life, how we should live. Now, the entire creation began as that perfect circle, as we talked about. And to make room for creation, God had to constrict himself, and his infinite light was obviously hidden, so the darkness was seen instead. So pi was used to bring us to understand what the circle was. Now, the circle in Hebrew is zimzum, zimzum, and we'll cover a lot of information about that later. So in a whole, we might say then a perfect way, well, hopefully you can see how pi made its first appearance in the creation account. Now I want to look at the first verse again. And the first thing that we need to do to understand is that the creation is metaphysical. In other words, it's not just about matter, but it's about intelligence and it's about information. Let's go back, and I'm going to put up again my little wordly chart. Here we go. No, my cursor's not working. We went through this. Here we go again. We're going to do another number count. This time, we're only going to count the red letters. Now, I know, and you know, there's a total of 7 red letters. But I want to know what the value of those 7 red letters are. And remember, every letter has a value. For example, as we read this, first letter is in Bereshit. Bereshit's the first word on the left, is bet. Bet has a value of 2. Next one is Hey. Hey has a value of 5. The next one is a Vav. It has a value of 6. So we have 2 plus 5 is 7 plus 6 is 13. Plus Hey, another 5. So 13 plus 5 is 18. Plus an Aleph, which is 1. That's 19. Another Aleph, which is 1. That's 20. And Bet is a 2. So that's a total of 22. So we have a total of 22. That's the value of the red letters. Now divide the total by the number of words in the lines. So you divide 22 into 7. What do you get for an answer? Well, you don't have to do it. I wrote it down for you. 3.1425285. Do you recognize that number? That's pi. This is the only verse in the Bible that will get you 3.14. It's the only verse. It's the first verse. It's how he starts. So we have to understand then that pi was so significant, it was part of creation. Now, as we go through this, according to the Midrash and Bereshit Rabbah 1:1, God first created the Torah as a blueprint for creation, and afterwards he created our universe. Now, like a builder who first creates a blueprint for his building before making it, thus the Torah existed before the creation. The Torah is the blueprint. The opening word of the Torah is Bereshit, in the beginning. If we take the previous letters of each of these words, notice what we get. Now, somehow my bet disappeared over here. Can I put it in? Nope, can't put it in. Okay, so bet is here. Bet is 2. Resh is 200. Aleph is 1. Shin is 300. Yud is 10. Tav is 400. Total 913. Now, instead of using the first letter, I want you to go back 1 letter, rotate back. And again, this is a form of gematria that you and I would never use because we wouldn't know what we were looking for. So instead of a bet, we now have an Aleph. Instead of a Resh, we now have a Kaf. Instead of an Aleph, we don't have any letters in front of Aleph, so therefore it has to be another Aleph. Shin is Resh. Yud is Tet. And Tav is now Shin. Now we look at those letters and what their values are. And notice what we get. 1 plus 100, 101, 102, 302, 311, 611. The value of those letters now is 611. Does anybody remember what word has the value of 611 we've just talked about? Torah. Torah. The value of the word Torah is 611. Did God hide Torah in the first word? Did he mask it over? I want to show you another gematria, because right below it, I did the gematria of Torah, which is Tav, Vav, Resh, He. 400 plus 6 plus 200 plus 5 is 611. 611. Bereshit, Torah. Now, the sages would tell us that this hints that the Torah came before Bereshit, before the creation, as the Midrash says, no problem. What is the Midrash of the entire first verse? Well, as we saw earlier, the first verse actually hints of pi. One more scene. Be prepared to be amazed. Here's the first sentence. Here's the first sentence. This time I started on the right. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashmaim ba'et ha'eretz. I now did the math for you. Bereshit is 913. Bara is 3203. The gematria of Elohim is 86. The gematria of Et is 401. Hashmaim is 395. Ba'et is 407. And finally, the last word, Ba'eretz, is 296. So if I took simply added up those first 611 numbers or words, well, let me do you this. Here's the word for pi. Here are all the numbers that you would need if you were going to go and count for 611 times. The sum of these 611 numbers that make up pi, can you see what you get? 2701, the value of the first verse. So what are the chances? What are the chances? Coincidence? I don't think so. So in those 1,000 years when God was thinking about what it was going to look like, and he was writing his Torah in his mind, he was doing it also mathematically. He didn't need a computer like we do. It was just in his head, in the head of things. Now, next time, there will be a next time. The next time, we're going to talk about the value of 82. Doesn't seem like they're related, but give us time. This is where we're going to go. Now, it is 8 minutes left. I'm going to stop sharing and look at everybody and say, you are very nice looking people, even if you are blanks. But anyway, back to the story. Anybody, I shouldn't ask the question because I'm sure you probably have some, but are probably too worried about asking them because there's these other people around. But anyway, is there anything that I can help you with before we get off the air?